Anyway, thank you all for coming today to this little workshop. I like to call it a workshop. It'll be a bit of a teaching, but also hopefully an opportunity for each of you to share a bit and work with this topic of grief and loss. What we're going to do is start with a short meditation. I don't think we'll be doing any formal prayers today. We'll just set our motivation as part of this meditation. So find a comfortable meditation posture and just begin to attend to the breath. And we're just going to work with the breath a bit, and I'll give you some other guidance after a few minutes of silent meditation on the breath. So let's go ahead and start with that now. So as you continue to be present with the breath in whatever way you've chosen to work with the breath, I'm just going to guide you in a short reflection, investigation. We can start our day today with our bodies, our minds a bit more present and relaxed. But first, we want to bring our awareness to our bodies to kind of look at the physical dimension of our being. So as you continue to breathe, simply take note without any judgments as I guide you with the following questions. First, is your body somewhat relaxed or is it more rigid? Where is it on that continuum? Is the body loose or tight? And then in regard to the energy of the body, do you feel somewhat energized or more fatigued? And where on that continuum do you see yourself? And without any judgment. And then in regard to the flow of energy in the body, is it moving freely Or is it somewhat sluggish or constricted? And just assess how the energy is flowing in the body. And to what degree is the energy flowing fully throughout the body rather than being constricted or stuck in places? And just assess the energy of the body. No judgment, just taking note. And now let's focus on the mind. Bring your awareness to your mind. And as I guide you with the following questions, once more, simply take note. There's no judgment. We're just simply assessing where our minds are at this point. Is your mind on the calmer end of the spectrum or a bit more stressed, anxious? And where is it on that spectrum? And in regard to the clarity of your mind, does it feel somewhat lucid and clear? Or is it towards the foggy end of the spectrum, the mind not feeling so sharp? And where are you on that spectrum? And then our mental energy. Does the mind feel somewhat vibrant? Or is it feeling somewhat tired? Again, the same fatigue we might see in the body can manifest in the mind. Just take note where you are in that spectrum in regard to your mental energy. Now we let go of investigating the mind and body, and I want to invite you to bring your awareness to your heart center. And it's at the level of the heart, but in the very center of your chest. Just bring your awareness there and try to be present in that space of being at your heart center. And as you abide in this space at the heart, try to let go of all the various events of today or this past week and try to simply be present in your heart center, not allowing any of that to interfere. As you continue to breathe, as you exhale, try to release anything you wish to be free of in your body or mind, any rigidity or fatigue, any constriction of energy, any of the stuck places, any foggy mindedness, stress, anything else in your mind that you wish to be free from, as well as your body. As you exhale, just simply let that go. And continue to be present in the heart as you do this, simply letting go of whatever it is you wish to be free of in this moment. Now, as you inhale, on each inhalation, invite into your heart all the relaxation, energy, calmness, clarity, anything else that you wish to receive. Feel your heart open, soften, and expand. Just try to abide at your heart center with all the relaxation, presence, calmness, whatever it is that you have received. And now from your heart center, begin to send out that same energy, relaxation, calmness, openness to the other hearts that are gathered here with you today in this room physically as well as online. Feel the spacious connection, the love, the support. And in this space of connection, generate a motivation for being here that is aligned with the desire for healing for all, for each of us to come together in this space to find what we need to contend with the challenges of life, particularly grief and loss, and to be able to learn and grow from these experiences. That sincere wish for ourselves as well as for others. And let that be your motivation for being here. And add on anything else that it is that brought you here today that you wish to receive from the time we spend together. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin our workshop. So again, thank you for inviting me to do this. I didn't know the timing would be so unusual for me, because this is my dear mother here who passed away on June 6th. And so I'm I'm a little raw in my grief myself, but that's okay. That's maybe a better place to teach this from. I'll give a little history to what I've done this workshop probably about 5 or 6 times now, and it actually started during the pandemic. The group up in Colorado, in Denver, wonderful study group up there. They were a full-fledged center at the time. During the pandemic, they shrunk to a study group, but nonetheless, they invited me to do a workshop for them in 2021. And I had noticed, of course, that I think we were all dealing with some level of grief at that point during the pandemic. There even was an article I came across in the Harvard Business Review that was published on March 23rd, 2020. Everyone try to recall what was going on March 23rd, 2020. And that was like just a few weeks after we had gone into shutdown, maybe even only about a week. But the article's called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And of course, when we begin to analyze and look at what was going on at that time, there was this huge shift in our kind of overall experience, a universal experience. Really, everyone in this world, all the human beings at least, were moving in a very different direction from where they were previous to that. And grief, of course, is a natural response to those sorts of changes. And of course, many people also lost loved ones during the pandemic, and we're dealing with again, more direct forms of grief that we'll get into as part of today as well. But nonetheless, I was finding that it was really kind of useful for people to talk about grief because even in Buddhism, I don't see much about grief at all. In fact, the only book that I've seen around grief, I've got it on my bag back here, is a book published by Guy Newland, who's a wonderful teacher in our tradition. It's called The Buddhist Grief Observed, which is based on C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed, which was when he lost his wife. Guy Newland wrote about his experiences as a Buddhist when he lost his wife of 28 years. So there's really not much out there about grief. We talk about it in indirect terms and the way that we approach various subjects. But I think it's really important that this subject be discussed and that we find a healthy way of working with grief because we are all experiencing some level of grief in our lives. And certainly um, uh, we will have moments when grief becomes much deeper, much more personal for us. I want to mention a few things of kind of logistics before we continue. One is we are recording this session. So if there's any time when you're sharing, because I do want people to share as part of today, that you would like the microphone or the recording turned off, I'll be asking folks to do that. I think Bill is monitoring things here in the Gompa. So we just let us know if you want to say something that will not be recorded for posterity. Just because we all have different things that we might not be comfortable with sharing and something that would be again recorded. We might be fine in sharing it here in this context. I just want to give people permission for that, all right? The other thing is that I do want to mention that I'm not a grief counselor. I don't have any professional expertise when it comes to working with grief. And if you are finding that you are in a space where you need that, either what's going on for you at this moment or what might be going on for you in the future, I really encourage you to seek professional advice. I'm going to tell a little bit of my story in a moment, but I found working with a um, psychologist during my grieving back in 1992 was really, really helpful, really kind of gave me permission to go to places of exploring it that I wasn't getting from my circle of friends, especially when you're experiencing something that's somewhat unique to you and other people in your life are not experiencing it as directly. It really helps to have some professional support. Um, and again, we're working with this emotion of grief. And so be kind to yourself throughout today. And of course, what might come up for you on the basis of today, be sure to take care of yourself. These are and some raw emotions that we might have even suppressed earlier times in our life that could be coming forward by looking at this subject. So again, try to be aware of that possibility. I want to introduce you as well to what is called like a regulating exercise. I had never heard of this till one of my friends in California exposed me to this idea. We're going to do it together. I'm going to give you the instruction first, but essentially what we're going to do is we place our two hands, one right hand, kind of affects the microphone here. Our right hand will be placed over our heart center that we were working with in the meditation, right? And then our left hand is going to go kind of over our abdomen, wherever you feel comfortable placing that. And just notice the weight of your hands. Actually, it's best if I just guide you in this. And you can close your eyes if you wish. Begin to pay attention to the weight of your hands in these two places. Again, your right on your heart center, your left on your abdomen. And just keep your focus on how heavy your hands feel. You may or may not feel warmth under your hands. That's not important. Just to simply feel the weight. Now you can just simply continue to feel the weight of your hands. And there should be some sort of shift that occurs in your breath as you just stay present with this sensation. And if you're not feeling anything, that's okay. Just try to tune into whatever sensation might be happening, whatever change in the breath there might be from placing the hands in those two places. But once this shift occurs, then in a sense we are regulated. And we can continue to feel this regulation for a bit. And then eventually we simply move on. So I'm introducing you to the exercise of regulating because you're free to do that anytime. You know, if you do find that emotions are coming up for you and you simply need to kind of be present in your own space of working with that, it helps to shift the breath by holding, again, the hands in these two places and just, again, paying attention to the weight. Did anyone experience something in that in regard to doing it, getting some nodding of heads? Again, don't worry if you didn't, but you might try this occasionally throughout today. And I may even encourage you at some point to do some regulation. So what I'd like to do, we don't have too many folks in the room, and I really do think it's important. Like I said today, I want people to be able to share. So I will share last, actually. I hope that's okay, but I want to go ahead and introduce my story as part of the opening thoughts for today's workshop. But I'd like to invite whoever's comfortable, and if you aren't comfortable sharing, then by all means you don't need to. But I'd like to one by one invite people to simply talk about, introduce yourself in terms of your first name, and then what brought you here today, or what it is that you are looking to receive or learn from our time today. So it doesn't have to be really long, just a way of introducing. If you do find that you want to talk a little bit more and you and want the recording stopped, please let us know. But let's just go ahead and begin there. That's okay with everyone. Maybe we'll start online. Shayla, would you mind starting as our host online? Yes.
I don't mind at all. My name is Shayla, and I chose this class because death is inevitable, and we also there's so many losses in life, whether it's death of an animal, a beloved pet, or a loved one, a human. But yeah, we've all had loss, and for me, I can definitely use some tools for this loss.
Good. Thank you for sharing that, Shayla. Appreciate it. Let's continue online. Karen, are you okay sharing? If you can unmute. Yeah. You need to unmute, Karen. You've got your microphone on mute. There you go.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Karen Bender. I live up in northern New Mexico. I think for me, grief right now evolves around the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. You know, it happened in 2022, and you know, it was very devastating for community. It's been a tough 2 years dealing with the aftermath, and in December, I finally got done with FEMA, and I thought, oh, okay, it's kind of behind us. And then this week we had flooding again, and it wiped out our road that we had gotten fixed. And so I'm back again having to deal with road contractors. And so it's a grief of sort of a loss of the beauty of this land here and the sanctuary of the land.
Mm.
It's back to
Mm.
struggles.
Mhm.
So I'm glad we have this workshop this weekend.
Yeah, I know you were planning to attend, Karen, but unfortunately with the weather, it wasn't possible. But I'm glad you're able to come online. And yeah, I mean, that's a huge community of grieving, and we all grieve with you because it is very challenging. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Let's continue online then. Melanie, would you mind sharing?
Good morning, everybody in New Mexico. I'm in Montana, and I am here because actually I am a grief therapist for one thing, but primarily here as a Buddhist because I found myself when my husband died 10 years ago, my husband Bill, I found my Buddhist practice not very helpful and the Buddhist concepts not very helpful. In fact, I found myself envious of my Christian friends who thought they were going to see Bill again in heaven, you know. So this is something I've been struggling with actually for a while about how to work with my own loss in relationship to being able to understand and move forward and continue to remember him. So I'm very grateful that you're offering this, and I'm grateful to see you all there. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Melanie. Thanks for coming in from Montana. Appreciate it. Let's go to Tinta, who's probably the furthest away from here in Madrid. I know her from the teaching group there in Madrid, Spain.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Don. My name is Tinta. I'm in Spain right now, not actually in Madrid, but I can change my name. After these last 3 years, I've gone through a lot of losses. I've lost like everything, people, places, my job, my health, and I realized I don't know how to grieve, that I've been dissociating most of my life. And in Buddhism, I found some answers, but not as much as I would have liked. And then I realized you were doing this seminar. So thank you, Don, and thank you, everyone. That's it.
Thank you, Tinta. Good to have you here. Appreciate you coming in. Bobby, please. Good to see you, Bobby. Then, there you go.
Hi, Don. I came to see you. Well, actually, it is part of my sort of, it's not exactly grief, but it is grief low level. You know, I've been gone from Santa Fe for going into my third year now, and I still miss everybody, you know, and Zoom is wonderful, but it's very ineffectual at the same time. I am in a difficult position, I guess, of dealing with my third dying cat in a year and a half. And they are, been with me a long time. And he's taken his sweet time and he's skin and bones. And so I'm having grief and anticipatory grief at the same time. And anticipatory grief is something that, has lurked around the edges for quite a while. And I also, and you can relate to this, I have a 93-year-old mother who's independent and lives in her own space, but the anticipatory grief is there. I'm very aware of it. And over the last 10 years, she's become my best friend. So that's why I'm here, looking for some magic.
It's good to see you, Bobby. And yeah, I'm sorry you're going through the loss of pets like that. It's hard when they come, in a row in a sense, because like you said, the anticipatory grief, which we'll touch on a little bit today as well, is present often when we're dealing with these sorts of losses and people who are declining in health or whatever. But it's tough. You're here with us today.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thanks, Don.
Yes. Also from far away. Fine. Unmuting and sharing if you'd like. If not, that's okay too. Are you there, Anna? Oh, there we go.
Hi Don. Hi Gen Don, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Thank you. I think a few things that have brought me here today. Thank you. One is the death of my mum, which I haven't seemed to have grieved in a typical way, if really at all. The aftermath brought some other real tragedies in itself. Um, but also my mum took a while. It was a number of years. My mum was really ill, and she was an avid gardener. She wasn't religious. She had a great approach to, death and birth. And she used to say, "I'm from Liverpool, UK, and we've got a river, the River Mersey." And she used to say, "Oh, just cremate me and chuck me in the Mersey. I'll travel the world." She was more relaxed about the inevitable, the death that comes to us all, and I think that really helps. So I just want to look into that area as well, and also as I am forever maturing and growing up and trying to understand the world, I find there's some grievances there that the world is changing, society's changing, family dynamics are changing, but the world doesn't still seem to be as I think it should be, but quite dramatically. So, I feel that's quite a big grievance to me at the minute, that things aren't as they are advertised or as I view. um, so yeah,
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna, for sharing, especially about your mother. Appreciate it. Yeah. Uh, would you mind? Oh, this microphone seems to be going in and out. Is it going in and out online too? Yes, it's going in and out online. Okay, we'll see what we can do about that. Okay, Barbara, would you mind sharing? Sorry. Hi, Barbara.
Again, Don, it's so nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
To me, there are so many different levels of grief, from significant grief, loss of parents. I've lost both of my parents, loss of love, of loving relationships, and then just the more subtle loss of change, of disappointments. And I guess I'm here today to just again have resources. This is part of life.
Right.
Grief is just such a part of life, and almost everyday life to varying degrees. So the reason I am tuning in today is to just learn and to develop some skills and some techniques. So I really appreciate your being here.
Is this working now? Yeah, okay. We just changed the batteries. Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that. Yeah, the variety of things that we grieve are certainly a part of the picture as well. We'll touch on that as part of today. So thank you for sharing that, Barbara. Yeah, good to see you. Mary Jo, would you mind sharing, unmuting and sharing?
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me? Okay.
We can hear you fine, Mary Jo.
Okay. Hi. Yes. Thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be here. And the grief that I most recently have been feeling is the grief of losses having to do with aging. And I have been quite able-bodied for a number of decades. And now I'm in my 8th decade, and all of a sudden I've had a number of things, physical things to deal with, and injuries. I don't bounce back. I've been moaning and groaning and hobbling around. I'm coming out of that now, fortunately, but after several months. And in the past, it would have been, well, a few days, probably, maybe a week or two. But loss of hearing, loss of vision, loss of teeth, loss of balance, um, loss of being, I'm sort of out of the main flow of life, it feels. And a lot of that is by choice. A lot of being out of the main flow. You know, I live in the country by myself, although I have a good close neighbor and a few other neighbors that are not quite so close, but it's just that is upon me now. And I also, you know, I have loss of innocence. I had abuse going on as I was a child. And I realized that was a pretty huge loss, a loss of innocence. So I'm very happy to be here. And I have a lot of things outside that I've been waiting to get energy to do, and I may, Dawn, be leaving at noon. I'm not sure I will be able to stay for the afternoon, but thank you, and thank all of you.
Okay, thank you, Mary Jo. Yeah, yeah, and if anyone else does need to leave for part of the day, know that this is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to tune into what we did in the other part of the session you missed. So thank you, Mary Jo, for sharing that. And I'm sorry you're going through so many different losses and difficulty, but it is, yeah, something that we all face if we live to those older years and deal with the realities of life, as we're going to talk about. But it's still sad. It's still something we do have to confront. Yeah. Amata, do you mind unmuting and sharing if you would like? Not sure if Amata's hearing me. Amata? Let's see, Botella there. Let's see. Let's go to Helen then. Helen from New York, would you mind sharing? Great.
Hello, Gen Don. How are you? I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you, appreciate it.
I am joining today. My mother recently passed,
Oh, I'm sorry.
so I'm hoping to take away some grief methods.
No.
So.
And very sorry for your loss, Helen. I know it's very hard. Just take a breath. Again, feel free to regulate if you need to in terms of these very personal losses that all of you are sharing. Appreciate it, but it's very hard. Glad you could be here, Helen. Thanks. Amata, are you able to unmute now? I know you wrote that you were.
I am, yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. No worries, no worries.
Yeah, I'm very much here, very much taking in what everybody's sharing. And you know, to state the very obvious, it just always touches me so much in group sharing. You know, the resonance, every topic of grief, facet of grief that was touched upon, you know, I can relate to, from illness to aging to injury to personal natural disaster with the flood we had here and the constant aftermath, the world grief, loss of animal companions, anticipatory grief. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this at this very tender time for you, Dawn. And you know, my parents, I can relate to the person. I have a 91-year-old father, 88-year-old mother. That, you know, anticipatory grief stuff is there because they're probably amongst my best friends as well. Loss of love, loss of innocence, all of that everybody shared. I can deeply relate to at this time. Yeah, and I run an animal sanctuary, and for the last 20 years I have. Death is something I deal with regularly, and grief and loss there. I've just had 2 in a row in the last month, and I am still processing the loss of 2 very, very beloved residents here. So I'm grateful to be here, to be getting some tools. I am well aware that I do avoidance with the load of grief and loss I carry with work. And I want to make the big announcement that I actually worked very hard to schedule today, that I didn't have to be multitasking with the 100 animals here. I will have, I had some work with them before the workshop. I'll do some at lunch and I'll do some after, but things are ordered such that I can just be here, and I need that, and my body needs that, and my soul needs that. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad you can be here all day, Amata. I know how hard you work for those animals, having visited there and of course been interested in all of your work for many years now. So thank you for joining. Let's go to the folks in the space here. We've got a microphone, if you don't mind speaking into that so everyone can hear you, especially those folks that are online. Bill, did you want to start? Are you comfortable starting? He's the one with the microphone.
Sure. I'm here today to run the AV. And I've been on one of your prior workshops on the same topic. Really moved me then, and it helped me deal with a lot of grieving for my sister and my parents and other people that I had just sort of blocked inside my skull. So thank you for that, and I'm so glad to be here.
You're welcome. Glad that you're here, Bill. Okay.
Hi, it's Phyllis. And I have a lot of things to grieve about. Old age is one, in my 80th year. So very similar to Mary Jo, all these things are beginning to decline, and I can't do all the things I'd like to be able to do. So that's one. And I was going to go, as I sat here, I remembered my first really difficult grieving was my father. I didn't know it would be so difficult. So I felt like I fell off a cliff. It was a surprise of what he held in the world for me, and I didn't know when he was alive. Just did. And so I paid a lot of attention to my mother before. She had another 10 or 12 years, and I paid a lot of attention to dealing with issues with her and making sure I wasn't caught out the way I was with my father. So that went pretty smoothly, although I was pretty angry when she died. When she actually passed, I was with her. I was surprised to see all this anger come up. Anyways, and then probably the most difficult was my husband, who passed away on the 27th of this month. It'll be 13 years.
Wow.
And that's also a surprise how long, I'm still missing him and missing the comfort of having him present.
Wow.
And then the world situation is difficult. And then I have lots of concerns about people that I know that are in some various forms of crisis.
All right.
That's it.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Thank
for
you,
sharing.
Don, for doing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I'm glad that you're here today, Phyllis. Let's go to maybe whoever would like to go next, just as long as everyone gets a chance to go. Okay.
Thanks. Sorry. Space. Yeah, I actually also belong to the Thich Nhat Hanh group, and there's a special teacher so I will be leaving at lunch.
Okay.
But when I heard grief and being here with you, when we had the puja for your mom and crying with you, and my parents died ages ago. They were quite old when they had me, and my sisters. My current grief is losing my home. Let me just say it is not easy being a renter in Santa Fe. And I've now moved into low-income senior housing. So I've lost a garden. I've lost a beautiful space. And I lived there for 10 years, and I made it I knew where everything was, and now I don't. And I'm cognitively losing some things from not having that familiarity. And I describe her as my ex, but she's actually been one of my best friends for the 42 years that we both happened to move here at the same time. Is 88, and she's got a lot of physical. She had 6 kids, and her daughter died a year and a half ago. And very much cognitive stuff. So that's the kind of loss that I see around me. Physically, I'm pretty damn fit for 82. Niece spent 30 years of gardening for people in this town. It's not so happy, but other than that, pretty good. So yeah, it's true. I haven't heard anything about grief in Buddhism. So some of it's anticipatory because I know people around me will be dying.
Right.
And hopefully not my wife before me.
Yeah, I hope not either. I hope you both have long, happy lives, Faith. Yeah. Please, Marion, are you comfortable sharing? Yeah. Good.
Oh, yes. Last year, we lost my brother. He had Parkinson's, so the end of his life was very challenging. And I found that I lost a couple of friends in the process of losing my brother. Anyhow, so it's, I guess the passage of life has its challenges.
And it does. Thank you, Marion. Glad that you're here today. I'm sorry for your loss. Yeah. Please.
My name is Inji, and I'm here mainly because a few years ago I lost my sister.
Sorry.
Just like in a very tragic way. It still feels really hard to be present with that.
I understand.
And then also just the loss of a relationship about a year ago that I thought I had moved past. And then this past week, kind of just like hitting me in a very intense way, as I know grief has kind of, sometimes it's it's been unpredictable. So yeah, I'm mainly here for those 2 reasons. And I've always found some comfort in the Buddhist teachings. So just open to whatever I hear today.
Thank you for being here, and I hope it's of some benefit. I'm really sorry for the loss of your sister. That must be really challenging.
I'm David, and fortunately, right now, I don't have any specific grief issues that I'm aware of, but I'm here, I think, just to get a different perspective on grief and maybe get some different insights on how to deal with it, because sooner or later it's going to come up, and I'm just hoping I can be a little better prepared for it.
Good. Glad that you're here, David. I hope so too. It's good to have some tools to work with in advance, but yeah. Please.
Hi, this is Tony. Don, deepest sympathy in the passing of your mom.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And I'm here for a whole bunch of reasons. Starting with the first noble truth. Life is dukkha. My personal interpretation of dukkha is an unpleasantness. Missing the train, not getting where you need to be on time. These are catastrophic.
Right.
The entire range, nothing left out. And like everyone, loss in varying degrees. I identify my deepest grief as sorrow. And I still have it after 80 years. My twin died at birth. And I carry this. Yeah. And it's like when I was a kid at night lying in bed, lost, alone, and paralyzed in sorrow. So my grief, I just call sorrow. Right. Thank you guys for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for sharing that. I didn't know that about you, that you had a twin who passed away at birth. That's a hard one to live with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not as though I wouldn't talk about it.
Right.
But Nina did the first Death Cafe.
Death Cafe here, yes.
Back in March.
Yeah.
And it just came out. I said, I mean, I just like I said, there's something that has been that I've kept private. It's not as though I don't talk about it, but something that I've kept private, but I've never gone public. And I did during the Death Cafe.
Wow.
And that was a great treasure that that Nina gave me. And I wrote a short poem about the death of my twin and everything that's happened to me for the past 80 years. It's just seven short lines, but it came out. So thanks to TNL, Nina, the whole gang.
Thanks, Tony. Maybe we take a moment to regulate if you feel you need to. Again, there was a lot of grief I was hearing and sorrow from people in terms of your individual stories and what brought you here today. So again, you can just simply place your right hand on your heart center, left on your abdomen, and just tune into the weight of the hands in those places. Just continue breathing normally and just wait for the breathing to shift a bit. And then we'll continue. So I'm going to tell my story very briefly because I don't know that I need to spend too much time on myself, but experiencing death brought me to Tibetan Buddhism. Back in 1993, I started studying. In 1992, I lost my first partner to AIDS in San Francisco. I was living in San Francisco and we had been together about 13 years. And his death was really, I was 34 years old at the time. And so it was just like this, it seemed out of sync with where I was in life to experience that type of loss of a partner at that time. I had not experienced much loss prior to that. I'd lost my grandparents, but really wasn't as close to them or anything. So it felt pretty profound in terms of a shift in my life and a need to examine, well, what is life about? And I found the wonderful book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyo Rinpoche, which I can't recommend highly enough. It certainly was useful for me in terms of exploring this whole issue of death, life, what is it all about, and helping me to move in a different direction. And so that's in a nutshell what happened. I don't know, again, that I need to share more than that. But I didn't really have much of a map for how to deal with grief. And as I said at the time, I didn't find that even though in San Francisco, of course, with the HIV epidemic, there was grieving everywhere. And I had so many friends that I had lost, coworkers I had lost, people that I went to, their memorial services and what have you, and you almost got numb. And I think a lot of my friends were numb. And the people who I went to who were not in that circle, straight friends that I had from college and what have you, couldn't relate in some way. I think it was just, at that age and that time in their life, they really weren't looking to have a kind of intimate experience of grief. And so I found I wasn't getting the support that I needed in many different directions. And it would have been nice to have some sort of compass, some sort of map to guide through that. I'm hoping that today can maybe give us a little bit of that. I do want to share a little bit on screen of, I called this workshop Learning from Grief. And I want to just talk about this idea of learning. And this is actually from a book about grief that I read not too long ago by Mary Frances O'Connor, sorry. And she wrote this book called The Grieving Brain. It's even though you think, well, I'm going to read a book about neurobiology to talk about grief, but she actually brings in both sides. She's also working intimately with people who are grieving, but looking at it from the perspective of neurobiology and what happens in the brain. It's a fascinating book to read maybe at a different point. If you're in the grieving process right now in a very fresh way, maybe not the ideal book. But she says decades of psychological research have given us insights into how the brain learns, and we can apply these to the grieving process. Psychologists have defined learning as the process by which changes in behavior arise as a result of experiences interacting with the world. This is primarily how we learn. I mean, we learn also by reading books and doing things and what have you, like teachings that you get, but we really are learning primarily through our experiences. And grief is an experience like any other in terms of having the potential to help us to learn and to grow. Though learning capacity and cognitive functioning cover a wide range of abilities, even within the normal population, we can say in the broadest terms that learning improves our ability to adapt. The great thing about learning is that it is a capacity and we can increase our capacity. Of course, we know this even from neurobiology, that we have this phenomenon called neuroplasticity, that our brains are not stuck in some mode and can never change. Rather, they change on the basis of how we learn and how we process and what we experience. So this is, again, just framing this whole idea of learning from grief. Coming into contact with death when we lose a loved one, which is, again, one of the more profound forms of grief. We will be touching on all manner of grief as we have in your introductions, but that can be overwhelming. It can fill us with awe, and it can cause us to reevaluate our view of the world, of our life, of our relationships. Death changes us, and we cannot function in the world in the same way as we once did. And this is what I was feeling at the time in 1992 when Ed passed away, and I was kind of like, okay, who am I in the world? Why are we here? I had grown up in the Catholic tradition, but I didn't find answers there to deal with what I was dealing with. Then she continues, she says, if you now understand deeply and truly that people we love can disappear forever, it changes how we love, what we believe, and what we value. This reevaluation is a form of learning. So I'm sharing that simply because it gives a context for what we're trying to do today, which is really to look at this process of grieving, our own experiences with loss, and to see how we can see it as an opportunity to learn. I might say that as we get started on all of this, that when people are in that very raw place when grieving is just starting, especially with the death of a loved one, a pet, what have you, it's very hard to just immediately go into that mode of, okay, this is a great opportunity to learn. So don't think that this is advice that I'd be giving to everybody in terms of how to work with Buddhist teachings. I think the initial experience of grief is simply to be with that sadness and to be okay with that sadness. We're going to talk about that as part of today as well. But to recognize that over time, when we have a slightly different vantage point, when we've been in the grieving process for a bit, then perhaps there are these windows of opportunity for learning that we can open up at that point, where that feels like the appropriate thing to do. But I want to caution in terms of that. And if you are feeling like where you're at in terms of your own grief is not allowing you to be in a space of, oh, great, I've got an opportunity to learn, that's okay. Some of what today, what we go through today will hopefully still be of some value, some benefit, and will always be there that you can go back to at a later point in time. So one of the stories that I came across, and many of you have heard this story before, but nonetheless, I'm going to read it again in Sogyo Rinpoche's book, is this wonderful story of Krisha Gotami. Let me see if I can pull this up on my Kindle here. This is a story that Sogyo Rinpoche says that he grew up with. He says, when I was a child in Tibet, I heard the story of Krisha Gotami, a young woman who had the good fortune to live at the time of the Buddha. When her firstborn child was about a year old, it fell ill and died. Grief-stricken and clutching its little body, Krisha Gotami roamed the streets, begging anyone she met for a medicine that could restore her child to life. Some ignored her, some laughed at her, some thought she was mad, but finally she met a wise man who told her that the only person in the world who could perform the miracle she was looking for was the Buddha. So she went to the Buddha, laid the body of her child at his feet, and told him her story. The Buddha listened with infinite compassion. Then he said gently, there's only one way to heal your affliction. Go down to the city and bring me back a mustard seed from any house in which there has never been a death. Krisha Gotami felt elated and set off at once for the city. She stopped at the first house she saw and said, I have been told by the Buddha to fetch a mustard seed from a house that has never known death. Many people have died in this house, she was told. She went on to the next house. There have been countless deaths in our family, they said. And so to a third and a fourth house, until she had been all around the city and realized the Buddha's condition could not be fulfilled. She took the body of her child to the charnel ground and said goodbye to him for the last time. Then returned to the Buddha. Did you bring the mustard seed? He asked. No, she said, I'm beginning to understand the lesson you are trying to teach me. Grief made me blind, and I thought that only I had suffered at the hands of death. Why have you come back? Asked the Buddha. To ask you to teach me the truth, she replied, of what death is, what might lie behind and beyond death, and what in me, if anything, will not die. The Buddha began to teach her, if you want to know the truth of life and death, you must continually reflect on this. There is only one law in the universe that never changes, that all things change, and that all things are impermanent. The death of your child has helped you to see now that the realm we are in, samsara, is an ocean of unbearable suffering. There is one way and one way only out of samsara's ceaseless round of birth and death, which is the path to liberation. Because pain has now made you ready to learn, and your heart is opening to the truth, I will show it to you. Krisha Gotami knelt at his feet and followed the Buddha for the rest of her life. Near the end of it, it is said, she attained enlightenment. So when I first read that story in my grief, it was pretty eye-opening too, because even though, of course, I wasn't so naive as to think that my grief was the only one in the world and that somehow I could remedy it in some miraculous way, it nonetheless opened up to this universality of this experience. Recognize again that we are not alone in our grief. This is a human condition. It's a condition of all beings to, of course, deal with this. The Buddha himself, of course, gave us many teachings on this topic of impermanence. This is one of the main teachings we should be getting or learnings we should be having by dealing with and confronting grief in all of its different facets, because they're all revolving around this concept of impermanence and change. In fact, there is even a contemplation that helps us to confront these sort of fears that we have of loss, of death, of having to deal with things in our lives that are painful. And I'm going to introduce these to you from the writings of Thich Nhat Hanh, from his book called Fear, Essential Wisdom for Getting Through the Storm. He says one of the most powerful ways to transform our fear of loss and death is with the practice of the 5 remembrances. If you breathe slowly and mindfully in and out, deep and slow, while you say these remembrances to yourself, it will help you look deeply into the nature and roots of your fear. Kind of interesting. I first found these 5 contemplations or remembrances through a book called Living in the Light of Death by Larry Rosenberg, who's in the Insight Meditation Society fold of Buddhism. It's kind of strange that in Tibetan Buddhism, we don't reflect on these 5 because they're really useful. If every day of our life we think about these and breathe as we contemplate them, it does help to alleviate some of the kind of the harshness of having to confront these realities. The first 3, of course, are dealing with aging, illness, death, and they're meant to hit home for ourselves. Though obviously we can translate these for others as well. I am of the nature to grow old. I cannot escape growing old. In other words, aging is inevitable. And if we live long enough, as some of you in the room are in your 80s and what have you, you're dealing with some of the ravages of aging and the inability for the body to be as vibrant and youthful and energetic and so on. This is in the nature of our bodies. If we do live that long, we have that experience. But aging even is happening during our lives in a variety of ways that we have to confront. Secondly, I'm of the nature to have ill health. I cannot escape having ill health. Every one of us has been ill at one time or another in our lives, and we will have many other occasions of being ill. Look at what happened again with the pandemic and so many people having to deal with that illness, many of them losing their lives, which leads us into the third one. I am of the nature to die. I cannot escape death. Death is an inevitability for every single person who is born, every being who is born. And I'm throwing these out here as a way of maybe this is kind of the stuff we could do in advance that we can work with every day that prepares us, especially those of you who maybe aren't actively grieving at this point, but looking at the opportunity to contemplate things that will help you to be prepared for the reality of what life has to offer. Number 4 is the one that hits home here with this topic that we're working with this weekend or this today. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. We really have to see this, that as much as we have great love for those in our lives and we enjoy their company and going through this journey of life with them, they cannot stay in our lives. They will exit this life or we will exit this life before them. One or the other is going to happen. And no 2 people go together. Even if they die together, they're still on separate trajectories from there. And that leads us into the 5th one, which is how we end up on that trajectory and where is the continuation of our being. I inherit the results of my acts of body, speech, and mind, our karma. Our actions, our karma, are our continuation. Everything goes forward on the basis of our actions, our karma that we've created in prior lives and this life. There is a continuity. I mean, that may be of some comfort, that there's some continuity of the being going on, but that being who they were is gone. There is a continuation that occurs on the basis of karma that will be producing another iteration of another being, and then, of course, another being until samsara ends, until that whole process comes to a halt. So Larry Rosenberg, in talking about these again in this book that I read many, many years ago, and I go back to it frequently, it's really quite useful. It doesn't deal with grief quite as much as it does with confronting our own mortality, but he says, this isn't the cheeriest set of reflections in the world, right? And I'm sure you got that from me reading them. You're like going, oh brother, I'm getting my nose rubbed into all these really harsh, painful things about our lives. And most people, when they first hear them, he says, feel some resistance. And I'm sure we do have that still within ourselves, even if we've meditated on these many times. They don't mind contemplating the Buddhist doctrine of impermanence in the world around them. But this is getting a little close to home. I think that's what happens with grief too, though, is that we see that things do hit really close to home for us. Suddenly we are confronted with not just the mortality of our loved one or the change of things around us, but our own process of change and impermanence, our own reality of having to face death, aging, illness, what have you. I want to share a little story that I came across in my little explorations around haiku. Most of you know of Kobayashi Issa. He was a a great, one of the three great Japanese haiku writers. And in his text that is called, I think the book itself was from a year of my life. It was written in 1819. And I'm going to read you the prose translation around this, and then I'm going to share with you the haiku that he wrote in response to this. His story was very sad. He had a lot of death in his life. And this is him in his own words, Isa saying, "It is a commonplace of life that the greatest pleasure issues ultimately in the greatest grief. Yet why is it that this child of mine, who has not tasted half the pleasures that the world has to offer, who ought by rights to be as fresh and green as the vigorous young needles of the everlasting pine, why must she lie here on her deathbed, swollen with blisters, caught in the loathsome clutches of the vile god of smallpox? Being as I am her father, I can scarcely bear to watch her withering away, a little more each day, like some pure untainted blossom that is ravished by the sudden onslaught of mud and rain." So he had already previously lost, I think, other children. Now he's got his 1-year-old, I think 1-year-old, 2-year-old daughter dying of smallpox before him. After 2 or 3 days, however, her blisters dried up and the scabs began to fall away like a hard crust of dirt that has been softened by melting snow. In our joy, we made what we call a priest in a straw robe. We poured hot wine ceremoniously over his body and packed him and the god of smallpox off together. Yet our hopes proved to be in vain. She grew weaker and weaker, and finally, on the 21st of June, as the morning glories were just closing their flowers, she closed her eyes forever. Her mother embraced the cold body and cried bitterly. For myself, I knew well it was no use to cry, that water once flown past the bridge does not return, and blossoms that are scattered are gone beyond recall. Yet try as I would, I could not, simply could not, cut the binding cord of human love. And then he went on to write this haiku. Let me share it. Oops. The world of dew is the world of dew. And yet, when I first read this, it made me cry because this is the feeling of grief so much, especially even with our Buddhist understanding of impermanence, right? We can kind of have this intellectual acceptance of this, that everything is constantly changing, that we have to deal with losing people in our lives and losing our own life eventually. And yet, we really still have some resistance to that. We still have some pain that is going to be there because this is a hard reality to accept. This, again, why grief, I think, can be so incredibly challenging for us. But again, also such a rich learning opportunity. So I don't want to, again, make it totally about these grief experiences and how painful and difficult they are. As part of today, we're going to be looking at, again, what are those sorts of windows of opportunity that we can open up to, that we can actually learn from. Okay. And with that knockiness, let's take a short break. I realize we've been going for like an hour and 15 minutes. We're going to go till about noon. And so maybe just like we've got some time. So although we've all been talking about grief, I want to share what are kind of the standard definitions of grief, or even some descriptions of grief that come from some of the readings that I've done and what have you. And why I'm doing this is because even though we talk about it, I think it's nice to acknowledge the various dimensions of it. This, by the way, is our outline for today, looking at the nature of grief by talking about its sort of, again, definitions or descriptions of it. We'll go into the causes of it as I see them slightly from a Buddhist perspective. Obviously, there are different ways that this could be approached. The necessity of grief, then the process of grieving, touching a little bit on what is sort of more common knowledge around what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler came up with in their book on grief and grieving. And then using grief on the path. This is the heart of it, where we really want to spend a bit more time looking at the teachings that Buddhism has that perhaps we can find some opening to in our grief. So this is again, a dictionary description, which I always find dictionary descriptions are so bland and so uninteresting, but this is a good place to start, perhaps. Grief is deep mental anguish as that arising from bereavement or an instance of this. Well, for one thing, this makes it sound like if it isn't deep mental anguish, it's not grief. And I don't think that that's the case at all. You know, I think that, again, we're all dealing with different levels of grief. I'm going to talk about this a bit more from a bit of Guy Newland's book. But certainly it becomes more intense when we do have that deeper experience, without a doubt. This is from a book I haven't had the opportunity to read this yet. I just came across it, and I think it was just published earlier this year. Grief counselor, Claire Bidwell Smith, who says in her book, Conscious Grieving, at its most simplistic, grief is the emotional, physical, and cognitive response to losing someone or something important to us. I like this description a bit better, right? Because it's really opening up to that idea of its loss at whatever level. It can be the loss of someone in our lives in a very permanent way in terms of someone dying, but even people who move away. You know, we have a grieving that happens when we are disconnected from those that we love. They live in another city, another part of the world. We also have things that are important to us. A job, a relationship, whatever. There's always going to be something that we are losing that triggers some emotional, physical, or cognitive response. This isn't including spiritual in this. We're going to get that in the next slide, but it does enlarge it to include the physical. I find it really quite interesting. There is a physical component to grief that we need to be aware of as well. It's not just a mental process. It's not just our emotions. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, in their book that I mentioned a short while ago, says grief is an emotional, spiritual, and psychological journey to healing. I like this. It's a little more poetic too, because I think that's the goal of it. I mean, whenever we go into a process of any form of grief, the objective, in a sense, is to heal, to come out on the other side with some greater sense of wholeness, if you will, with that integration of what we went through. Not that we're kind of going to be back where we were before the process, but we come out the other side with some form of healing. Then, again, a bit more poetic description here too from Jack Kornfield. He has some good writings on grief. He says, grief is one of the heart's natural responses to loss. When we grieve, we allow ourselves to feel the truth of our pain, the measure of betrayal or tragedy in our life. By our willingness to mourn, we slowly acknowledge, integrate, and accept the truth of our losses. And this is getting to that idea once more that it is a painful experience. Any level of grief or loss is going to have some measure of pain to it, even if it's just a momentary thing where, you know, something happens and we have to get over that loss perhaps rather quickly. We still are going to have some measure of pain. This idea of having a willingness to mourn, I might mention here that I do feel that in our culture, and most of you have kind of alluded to this already, we don't really have enough rituals to help people to grieve. I was quite touched when I read this book called The Beauty of What Remains by Rabbi Steve Leder. He talks about the tradition in the Jewish, and again, this is the particular form of Judaism that he practiced, and this is something I had never heard of before. And I really think that this would be wise for us to adopt across our whole culture. He says the Talmudic sages knew what they were doing when they mandated 7 days and nights of being taken care of by the community, of staying home, staying put, taking the time to remember and to pray. In Hebrew, this custom is referred to as Shiva. This word literally means 7, because after arriving home from the funeral and lighting a candle that will burn for 7 days, the mourners dedicate a full week to refraining from their regular activities, staying inside together and grieving. For 7 days, often sitting on low stools or pillows to physically mimic their emotional state, to literally feel low, the mourners are surrounded and taken care of by their community of family and friends. I mean, I know in our culture we used to have much more of grieving in the home and the ability for people to be in that space of being held by others. and people would show up with casseroles and do all sorts of things to take care of those who were grieving. I have to say, even from my recent experience with my mother's passing, that things just start moving. You have to kind of deal with go to the funeral home, and then you make arrangements, and then you deal with the funeral, and then you have the lunch after the funeral with all the people who came, and then you have the things you need to do to, deal with the house and the bills to be paid and everything. It's a shame we've gotten to a place in our complicated society and the way we do things that it's very hard to have the space to actually shut all of that off and just be with our feelings. I find it interesting. I was talking to my brother, and he was wanting to really move through. I'm going back to Indianapolis to help take care of her property. I'm actually the executor of the will, which gives me a whole nother level of stuff to deal with. But anyway, he's saying, well, he really wants all this dealt with so he can get it over with and then grieve. And I'm like going, wow, I can't do that. I need to grieve even in the midst of dealing with all this stuff. But I think this is something that we're missing in our culture, is the ability for people to simply have that. So those of you who, again, might be experiencing grief in the future, as all of us no doubt will do in some manner, but especially the loss of a loved one, try to carve that out, to really create that space. I know that when I went through Ed's passing, I had a bit more time to do that. Our workplaces are often even difficult. They give you like 3 days of bereavement leave or something, like you're going to get over it in 3 days. Even the 7 days here isn't enough, but it's a good start. And it's at that time when the loss is so fresh that it is important to mourn. So this idea of it being this incredible, painful experience, but it's important to go through it. We're going to talk about that more when we go into the necessity of grieving. One thing that we're touching on here as we go through this is once more this acknowledgement that this is pertaining to all forms of loss. This isn't just these deeper moments of grief. In Guy Newland's book, he actually gives them this wonderful little name. He says, wait, I've got one more quote, sorry, then I'll go on to that. The grief I've learned, this is Jamie Anderson, an author, she says, grief I've learned is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All the unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. This is the part of it that I find really touching. Grief is love with no place to go. I've been feeling that myself in this last 2 weeks or so, of like this reaching out for my mother, in a sense, if wanting to call or wanting to be with her. And of course, there's no one there. This absence is really quite profound. Once more, this is in the context of losing loved ones, that we find that there is that very painful experience of their absence, of not being able to kind of be with them. So first, Claire Bidwell-Smith is addressing this issue, and then I'll go to what Guy Newland shared. She says, we can grieve for many things. And this is where I want this to be, the time we spend together today, to be about whatever level of loss. Yes, we grieve for people, but pets too, jobs, moves, relationships, even ideas we had about ourselves or the way we thought life was going to go. Right? Many people grieve that life didn't turn out the way that they hoped it would, that they aren't in the place they would ideally like to be, relationship-wise, professionally, spiritually, what have you. When something ends or is no longer here, we experience a multitude of feelings. So again, grief has a lot of different dimensions to it. We might not call it grief at all these various levels, but it's certainly loss. It's certainly the reality that things go in and out of our lives, and we do have to deal with that fundamental truth. This is the name that Guy Newland gives to it. He says, grief is the process of adjusting to unwanted change. And as we've been discussing, since change is unrelenting, we bear every day unrecognized micro griefs. He calls them micro griefs. I kind of like that term. Oh, there's another micro grief. Just, whatever form of loss or adjustment we have to do in our lives to the reality of change. Loss and fear of loss give us our daily shape as we feel and think and choose, anxious and scrambling. This is a reality for all of us. And again, I don't think our society even gives permission for people to deal with micro grief. Somebody might say, well, I'm dealing with, this reality of having to do a move in my life or having to whatever. And they don't give it the permission to be seen in that light. As really, this is hard for us to adjust to this reality. I think in the pandemic, we of course dealt with that. One day we were living our lives with great expectations about what was going to happen in the months to come in 2020 and the lives that we were leading. And then suddenly there's this huge shift in all of that. And that uncertainty that we always live with was put in our face in a very, confrontative way. We're like, oh my gosh, I can't keep living my life the way it is because the world has changed. We didn't know what it was going to look like on the other side of this. Sure, many of us were hoping that it would be very quick, right? Oh, this will be over in a few months and we'll be back to normal. Obviously, it took a lot longer than that to get back to even what normal is. And what is normal anymore? It's a new normal. It's a different world that we live in. So grief, once more, is pretty pervasive. I think we need to give ourselves permission to grieve everything that we feel, again, some strong connection to, something that we find important in our lives, a person or a job, what have you, that we have to deal with that reality of those things coming to an end. Of course, deep grief has its own complications and can be very challenging for people. Guy Newland refers to it this way. He says, deep grief is a special case, a season in hell. We come to it when we lose someone we have set as our foundation, someone with whom and around whom we have built our lives and our identity. Along with the beloved teacher, child, parent, or partner, we lose our very selves. I think this is the challenge when you're dealing with loss of people in your lives, is because you are having to look at yourself even and reevaluate who you are in the context of losing that person who you had a particular role with as a sister, brother, son, daughter, partner, owner in terms of a pet, and one who took responsibility for the care of that being. This is the challenge of it. And deep grief can have, as I said, its own complications. I remember one of the most painful things that I experienced in San Francisco during the HIV epidemic were gay men who lost their partners, like I did, who were unable to get out of that. And that did happen to some people I knew who they more or less lived the rest of their lives, as I could tell. I'm not in touch with most of them, but they seemed to be under this cloud continually, that they never could get out from underneath. I mean, grief will be with us our lives. I can still say that I grieve Ed in my own way, in a very different way than it was in August 12th, 1992, when he passed away, right? It's a very different experience. But that grief carries with us. The loss goes with us. We have to then redefine who we are in relation to that being absent. One of the things I really liked about this book, The Grieving Brain, is that she kind of explained it in neurological terms. She uses the example right at the very beginning of like how, say, it's the middle of the night and you get up to go to the kitchen to get a glass of water and you're kind of stumbling in the dark. You didn't want to turn on the light to kind of get your photo sensors all highlighted or whatever so that you could be in the dark still. And where you would normally bump into the dining room table isn't there. Says we map our minds like this, right? To where the space that we live in, to where things are at and what have you, so that it's a shock when we have something that is meant to be there that isn't there. This is what happens when we lose people in our lives, right? They play a role. They're part of our furniture in a sense. They are a fixture that we now are navigating around the absence of. Oftentimes in Buddhism, we talk about absence. We'll talk about this later today, the absence of inherent existence. Well, this is the absence of something that we had in our lives, some person we had in our lives that now we have to adjust to. It's pretty profound. It takes our brains time to grieve. So grieving involves all these dimensions. It certainly involves, a physical dimension in terms of adjusting ourselves to that space, to that lack of that person or phenomenon in our life. So there's a lot to kind of deal with in regard to the nature of grief, and to kind of be open to that reality that there are many dimensions to it that we have to be sensitive to. Let's go on to talk about the next topic, which is the causes of grief. This is, again, we've touched on this a little bit already with the one quote I shared from you just a few slides ago. This is from Alan Wolfelt, who's also a grief counselor. He says, you see, love and grief are two sides of the same precious coin. One does not and cannot exist without the other. They are the yin and yang of our lives. Grief is predicated on our capacity to give and receive love. And of course, as human beings, this is one of our main features that kind of distinguishes who we are. I'm not saying other creatures, animals, and what have you don't have love, because they obviously have some sort of affection. But perhaps their affection is based more in a sense of attachment and a need for the kind of the what that relationship provides. Whereas we are capable of expressing love in so many different ways. The mental, the emotional pain of grieving is often exacerbated by the degree of love that we had. But this is what we have, the price we have to pay for loving, is that we will inevitably have to lose those beings, especially who we love, as well as the things in life that we love. Now, in Buddhism, we often do this delineation of love and attachment, right? Love is a very healthy emotion. And by love, we're not meaning all the facets of what we call romantic love, because romantic love often has a lot of attachment involved in it. Love is this genuine heart sensation of feeling a connection to another in the guise of us wanting that being to be happy, in the guise of us wanting to help them to find what they seek for their well-being. And this is what is underneath all of our loving relationships. And we wouldn't have loving relationships if we didn't have some genuine concern for the other person and their well-being. Of course, attachment gets involved because that is often just part of our mental makeup, right? Where we start to see it not from the point of view of the other person and their well-being, but from the point of view of ourselves and what we need. And then attachment becomes problematic often in relationships because we're looking at the other person as a means to accomplish what brings our happiness, as opposed to seeing them as someone that we want to place in happiness. So we have to be aware of how these two emotions work in our lives, but moreover, how they kind of play a role in grief. We can often see it manifesting in terms of when our grieving process starts to get too much focused on our own personal kind of absence of that person contributing to our lack of having what we need in our life or what we feel we want in our life. That is a part of the grieving process for sure. I'm not denying it. I would say that once more, going back to those men that I would encounter in San Francisco when they lost their partners and couldn't get over it, in my estimation, looking back on it from a Buddhist lens, it was getting stuck in that attachment mode. The grief that is never finding that their needs are going to be satisfied then because that person is missing in their life. They can't find the room in their heart to open up to love for another being. And the potential for it to become more genuine love as opposed to being solely about attachment. Attachment is when we are focused on getting what we want. And grief can fall into that very easily. And it's okay if it does to some extent, because we do have to acknowledge that part of the pain. When we no longer have that person in our life, yes, our needs are going to be thwarted to some degree. We're not going to have the potential to come home and enjoy a meal with them or do whatever it is that we enjoy about those relationships. But there's something deeper there that is going to be what we kind of hold on to in the midst of our grief as well. That is more important, and that is the love. The genuine love that we have for others, that is also part of feeling the pain, because that absence is hitting there too. But the absence becomes more about we are kind of sad for their not being in this world any longer. Sad for our possibly not even knowing exactly where that being is then. Of course, Buddhism has its own teachings about the continuity of mind and where we end up and what have you. So we can rest assured that that being is still kind of carrying on, but nonetheless, they're not in that form that we enjoyed them in. They're no that person that we are very close to, that we had that love for, is no longer here. So we can say that when we analyze it from a Buddhist point of view, there's going to be those two dimensions to our grief. One is going to be our sincere love for them, that is looking at them and really having sadness for them no longer being in this world. Kind of missing their presence in that way, because we don't have that object of our love and our genuine concern any longer. But watch when it falls into attachment, because that's going to be a part of the picture as well. If it becomes too much about myself and my no longer having what I want in my life, I think it becomes a little unhealthy over time. There's going to be some of that initially, absolutely, without a doubt. Anyway, that's kind of the mental component of it. What's interesting is, as I said earlier, there's a physical component to grief as well. When we talk about causes of grief, this physical absence is really quite profound. In fact, Joan Halifax Roshi, in her book, Being with Dying, she says, as mammals, we form complex bonds with one another. And when these bonds are broken, our very bodies grieve. This is a bit of that furniture thing, too, that I was talking about, where we really feel the physical absence of that being in our lives. That our bodies are grieving. We have to be attentive to that, too. And I had the good fortune of having a very dear friend at the time who was a massage therapist and did a lot of work with people who were in later stages of life. And I was even volunteering for her organization and doing some of that work myself. And she offered to do some body work on me as I was going through my grieving process. And I think that it's really important to pay attention to kind of that there's a physical component to grief. And if we don't kind of can deal with that by addressing that physical side through massage or through other forms of therapy that can help us to heal the body as well as the mind, that perhaps there's something we're missing there too. So anyway, those are, as I see it, some of the causes. Certainly, I'm not getting into all of the dimensions of what psychologists might say around grieving and what have you. But there is, again, a mental dimension that's about love and attachment. But there's also, of course, this physical dimension that we need to be aware of. Let's go on to the next topic. Just wanted to throw that in there. I think it gives us, again, some permission to also be okay with whatever it is that we're experiencing physically, mentally, that is a part of our process. Let me share this quote. There are some nice quotes about grief in the Book of Joy. I've taught on that a number of times, and I didn't realize how much was in there about grief. Grief is the reminder of the depth of our love. Without love, there is no grief. So when we feel our grief, uncomfortable and aching as it may be, it is actually a reminder of the beauty of that love now lost. So again, that's certainly one of the dimensions that we do want to acknowledge that is involved in it. I want to talk next, and maybe this is all we'll have time for before the lunch break, the necessity of grief. As I was saying, we don't really have that much permission in our world and in our society to grieve, but it is absolutely important that we do so. Once more from Steve Leder's book that I just read from a short while ago about practicing Shiva and the Jewish tradition. We lose so much love to death. And if that love was real and deep, the grief is real and deep. Grief is not a race to be won or an illness to be cured. To deny grief its due is to deny love. And I was reading one teacher, I don't even remember who it was necessarily. I have an idea who it was, but a commentary by one teacher in our tradition who was kind of pointing out that the Buddha wouldn't have grieved anybody. And I was like, that just sounds strange to me. If you talk about like a being who's like this imbued with incredible compassion for all beings, it would almost be grief would be a part of the nature of that being. Because how can you have this love and compassion for beings and not also be grieving the situation that they're in and the loss they have to go through and the death and everything else? Even His Holiness the Dalai Lama does speak about the grief that he experienced. I want to share a little bit of that. That's from the Book of Joy. Of course, this is in relationship to his teacher when one of his main tutors died. I'm not sure which one it was. He doesn't mention it in here. But he also grieved, of course, when his mother passed away. He was very close to his mother, and he found her loss to be very profound in his life. So this is His Holiness talking. He says, the way through the sadness and grief that comes from great loss is to use it as motivation and to generate a deeper sense of purpose. When my teacher passed away, I used to think, oh wait, I think I'm reading the wrong quote here. We've got a little friend here flying around. Sorry, maybe I can find that later. He talked about the sadness that he experienced when his teacher passed away. I think it's in another part of this book. Maybe I'll try to find that during the break. I think I got the wrong passage there for this. But he said it was really quite profound for him. As I said, for his mother's loss as well. I think we're doing us a kind of Buddhist a disservice by not to talk about grief in the way that it is talked about, at least in some other religious traditions. But there is, again, this kind of forbidden topic when it comes to a lot of society and what have you, where we're not really allowed to talk about our grief or experience it in front of others. So I think we have to be aware that there's an absolute necessity to deal with our grief and to kind of go through it. We often talk about this phrase of like the only way to get to the other side is to go through. We can't go around it. You can't bypass it. Even Rumi, the great poet, Sufi poet, said the healing of the pain is in the pain. The only way to get through our grief and to process it is to actually experience it, to actually feel it. I want to share something from a book by David Kessler, again, who wrote the book on grief and grieving with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This is a book that he wrote recently, a few years back, on called Finding Meaning, which he calls the 6th stage of grief. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later. But this is quite of an interesting story. He says, one night I happened to come upon a documentary called Facing the Storm about the buffaloes in Montana. Robert Thompson of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks discussed how buffalo run into the storm. We just had a storm here last night, right? If you want to get through the storm quicker, what do? You run into it, actually, rather than running away from it, because it just keeps following you, right? Thus minimizing how long they will be in it. They don't ignore it, run from it, or just hope it will go away, which is what we often do when we want to avoid our storms of emotion. We don't realize that by doing this, we're maximizing our time in the pain. The avoidance of grief will only prolong the pain of grief. I think this is probably a wonderful example that we can bring to mind that will help us to have that permission to grieve in whatever way we're experiencing. Better to turn toward it and allow it to run its natural course, knowing that the pain will eventually pass, that one of these days we will find the love on the other side of pain. And we're all dealing with our own forms of grief and whatever level of pain that we've had to experience in that process due to people or situations, changes, whatever it is that has occurred in our lives that has produced that loss. But there's an absolute necessity to deal with it and to actually have permission for it. I might mention that I actually got a little text message from Chris. Many of you know Chris, who was quite involved in the first Dharma support group that we had here at TNL many years ago. Of course, it fell apart during the pandemic, unfortunately. But she's actually hoping that perhaps as part of that Dharma support group, this was a way to provide support to members of our community when they were dealing with physical difficulties, needing groceries or whatever the case might be, but that we also find a way to have people have a support in their grief. And so I'm hoping that we can make that a part of the center here again and have even this dimension of working with grief. But it's really important that we find the avenues for that. When I was dealing with my loss of Ed, as I said, I went to my psychotherapist and spent time with him to help me to process it on a one-on-one basis. But I also went to a grief support group. And I think it's really important that we reach out in those times to what can support us. And when I was teaching on this in San Francisco in March, the same course, somebody brought to my attention that there's actually a free organization that offers support groups for people who've lost their pets. They're out of Washington State. Can't remember their name right now. I'll try to remember. Maybe somebody online even has used their services. But they have every week, I think at a particular time, where people can come in on Zoom and completely free of charge and be with others who are dealing with the loss of their pets. I think it's these sorts of things, once more acknowledging that grief is a healthy emotion. Yes, it's painful, it's difficult, but we have to experience this. We absolutely have to kind of go through to the other side. And as David Kessler was saying, on the other side, perhaps we are able to be, having gone through that tender situation, that more difficult situation, with the love that was there, that was always under the surface, and that was always a part of why we're experiencing that grief. So again, it's absolutely necessary that we go through this. I'm going to talk just very briefly about what is in this book, The Grieving Brain, as well, and why it is very difficult to work with grief and why sometimes we might end up suppressing our grief because we feel the needs of our life impinging upon that. That's because our everyday life experience, and this is for someone who's actively grieving, perhaps in a bit more of the deep grief, but nonetheless, doesn't necessarily have to be, we're kind of having two dimensions to our life. One is loss oriented, where we are doing the grief work. Grief will come in at various moments in our lives. When I was grieving with Ed's passing, I called grief an animal that shows up on your doorstep at the weirdest hours. It's like, it's there and suddenly you have to confront it because it intrudes on your life and it needs to be fed. It needs to be dealt with. It's also, of course, the letting go, continuing, relocating, bonds, ties. It's like everything becomes an adjustment. Of course, denial can happen there. We can have an avoidance of restoration changes because we can get kind of somewhat drowning in our loss. As I said, I think this is very much what these gentlemen in San Francisco that I was seeing who couldn't get out of their grief were finding it very difficult to move in the other direction. The other direction is restoration oriented on the right-hand side of the screen there. That's attending to life changes. Life keeps going on as you're grieving, right? You can't stop that. So there's a necessity to be attentive to both sides of this and make sure that our restoration oriented isn't neglected in the process of dealing with our loss. Attending to life changes, doing new things, having some distraction from grief. I admit that I did have some friends in my life who I was happy weren't grieving and that I could be with and not be all about my grief. And there were other people who it was very good to be with others who were grieving and to be in that dimension. Of course, we can have a denial or an avoidance of grief if we get too much involved in the restoration, too much involved in, okay, now I need to restructure my life on the basis of no longer having that person in my life or that job or whatever the case might be, and not give its due to the actual loss and grief that we need to experience. Of course, there's new roles, identities, relationships. But as I pointed out in that middle part at the bottom, we oscillate between these. We kind of go back and forth between what is more restoration oriented and what is more loss oriented. And this gives some dimension again to why it's important to find a balance between these two. At the beginning, it's going to be more loss oriented, absolutely. And we'll probably have very little energy for restoration oriented activities because that's not the main focus at that point. In fact, I'm even found as I was going through my last few weeks of grief after having lost my mom, that I didn't have much energy for restoration stuff at all. And I didn't even have the mental energy for it. I would get confused and not be able to think clearly when I was trying to do those sorts of things. Like it's okay to be in the loss-oriented dimension for some period of time, but just don't neglect the fact that there is this other side of it that we need to move out of. And that's what we're going to go into this afternoon to some degree. We look at what are the teachings we might open to over time. One of the most interesting things about Guy Newland's book, A Buddhist Grief Observed, is that he was challenged. And why he wrote this book is because he's, and why he even did any journaling during this process of grieving his wife's passing, was that he was challenged with this question from one of his students. Well, okay, you have all these Buddhist teachings. Of what use were they during your grieving? And it's kind of interesting. What he shared in regard to some of them is really quite eye-opening, because I think it takes some time for us to be able to open to some of what the Buddha taught, even what I've shared already today, right? The stark reality of impermanence, the fact that we all are going to age, to get ill, to die, all these sorts of things that the Buddha pounded home that are important for us to open up to. As Tony said, the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, the fact that what we are involved in is an unsatisfactory situation. That in and of itself isn't very comforting when we're dealing with loss, right? It's simply a fact that we begin to adjust to over time. It's more in the restorative kind of dimension of it as opposed to the loss-oriented. So just know that there are those two dimensions to what's going on in our everyday life when we are dealing with some measure of grief or loss, and to be respectful of the needs of both of those. The necessity, especially of going through the grieving of the loss, because otherwise the restorative piece can't really happen so fully. The ability to open up to how teachings might influence our perspective afterwards. I found the teachings in Tibetan Buddhism probably, well, it was about I did get that book, I think, for Christmas of 2020, or I'm sorry, 1992. And then I started reading it in 1993. So it was several months after Ed had passed. It takes time before we can open up to new ideas and things that will give us some comfort, perhaps, in terms of moving in another direction. That's not necessarily where we need to be right off the bat. And for some of us, it might be quite a long time before we can open up to all of that. So what I want to do in the remaining part of today, and we'll have a short break for lunch, is to look at, again, the dimensions of teachings that will help us, as well as look at the process of grieving to some degree. I know that that isn't taught strictly in a Buddhist context, but I think it's worthwhile because it gives us some avenues to look at how we might apply teachings in regard to various things that come up in our process of grieving. You know, these 5 stages of grief that were set out initially by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler still have some validity. They're not, again, a linear thing at all, as we'll see this afternoon. But they still give us a context for how we can open to perhaps some of the restorative angles of how we begin to work with our loss. Whereas, once more, we need to also attend to and be respectful of the loss-oriented part of it that is really about the emotion and the grieving and making sure that we give that its due. Maybe one question, if there is a question, before we conclude our time together this morning? Anyone online? Let's see if I can get this. Bill, space you had, was it for you? You had something? Yeah, okay, please, go ahead.
This isn't really a question, but a little story.
Oh, please, yeah.
When Rowena was dying,
Mm-hmm.
we were very close because we had the same birthday and we were both at the center almost all the time. We did the puja, the
Medicine Buddha.
medicine Buddha, and
Mhm.
her family said she took her last breath at the end of medicine Buddha.
Yeah.
So I was on my laptop and I walked over to another part of my windows and looked out, and there was a kestrel sitting on the fence.
Oh, well,
And I said, "That's Rowena." And another time I was missing her. I'd gone to the Free Tibet Day, whatever
right,
it's called.
March 10th or whatever.
March 10th,
11th,
yeah. And the last time I'd been there with her. So I went home and I was sitting by the river and started crying, and their kestrel flew right over my head.
Wow. Yeah, it is interesting. I'm sure there's other people too with these sorts of experiences where suddenly something comes in or a field of awareness that we can't help but feel is that person sending a message or doing something to kind of like,
help me cry and made me feel better.
process.
It was a beautiful bird.
I mean, I'll say a very short story of, I think this was actually, if not the day after Ed passed, I went down to the corner store where I was living in San Francisco to get some flowers to put on just a little picture with him and whatever. I didn't have a altar at that time or anything, but just something I set up. And I go into the store, and on the loudspeaker was a song. It's the love theme from Blade Runner. If you recall Blade Runner, there's this one little theme that Vangelis wrote that is kind of like, it's the love theme. Anyway, it took me right back to Ed and I were headed to a Halloween party right around Halloween of one year, and we were listening to that music, and it was just a special night that we had together. And it's not a song you hear on the radio at all, generally, because it's just, I mean, who would play the love theme from Blade Runner? It's not even like, there's no lyrics, it's just music. And I just broke up. That was it. I just fell apart in the middle of the store. That was like a day or two after it. I think we do have those kinds of, there's like a thin veil between where that person is and where we are that they can get through perhaps, and we can have that kind of experience. But thanks for sharing that. I think those are, again, part of our grief as well, is to be touched in those ways and have that allowance to be able to express the emotion that we're having at the loss of those people. Mary Jo looks like she has something she wants to share, and then we'll hopefully take our break, but please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Don. I just wanted to quickly say thank you. This is wonderful, and covering so many of these complex aspects of grieving So thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome, Mary Jo. So this afternoon, we'll go into a bit more detail in terms of the process, and then, of course, working with these teachings that we can hopefully use sometime in our grief. Let's just have a moment of dedication just to think, through what we've done here already today, the time we've spent together. May this become a cause for ourselves and others to be healed from the space of their grieving, their loss, their sadness, to find true peace and happiness. Okay, so again, try to have a thoughtful break in between. If you want to talk to others who are in your here at the center or what have you, that might be helpful. But just take care of yourself, and we'll resume in an hour and a half. Here it'll be 1:30 New Mexico time. Okay, thank you all.